I'm Sarah Llewellyn. I'm the Chief Executive of the Barrow Cadbury Trust and Fund, and I'll tell you just a sentence about that in a moment. A warm welcome to everybody. It falls to me to do the housekeeping first, so I'll do that before I just make a few opening remarks, not many. First of all, just to remind everybody that we are filming and taking photographs, and you've all signed a disclaimer, so if you're not aware of that and you don't want to be photographed, now's the moment to make yourself invisible. Can you please turn off your mobiles? I know, or put them to silent. We are not expecting a fire alarm, so if there is a fire, that's the way out, but I'm assured that staff will come and get us and take us out to the assembly point, which is Dean's Yard. And toilets are right in the corner there, which for those of you that know this building and how difficult the toilets can be to find from some of the other rooms is quite a blessing. So a big welcome to Michael Mendelson, our international guest speaker today, and the impressive lineup of respondents. We're being chaired today by Kim Catcheside, who some of you will know well as a BBC correspondent on social affairs and I think on education at times as well, not in the pack. Just a word or two about the Barrow Cadbury Trust and Fund. The Barrow Cadbury Trust is the philanthropic foundation of part of the Cadbury family, the direct descendants of Barrow Cadbury, it was his name, and his wife Geraldine Southall. They were Quakers, and the social justice values of the Quakers and of the Cadbury family are still what drives the foundation today. The Barrow Cadbury Fund is part of our endowment kept in a non-charitable vehicle. So for any of you that are worried that we might be stepping wide of the mark of our charitable remit, today's event has been funded from non-charitable and therefore tax-paying finance. The strapline of the trust derives from an 18th century Quaker imperative. It's quite well known now, speaking truth to power, but not many people know that that's its derivation. And that's really the backdrop to today's event. We're bringing Michael here to share with us and with people in powerful places, including a good number of you in this room, the experiences of fiscal cutbacks in Canada in the 1990s. We've been actually bowled over by the response that we've had to Michael's visit from both sides of the House, from the media across the whole political spectrum. And I just wanted to say a word about our motive, which is that we see ourselves as honest brokers. We're not here to peddle a political line of any particular kind. Everybody in this room knows that the UK economy's in a mess, and I'm sure we have lots of differing views in the room as to what we ought to do about that. The Barrow Cadbury Fund founders cared about improving the lives of vulnerable and poor people and communities at their baseline, and it's through that lens that we're still looking at this and all the other issues that we work on today. And that's why we've brought you here today together, and I hope that you're all going to get something out of this thought-provoking or new material that you can take away and use positively in your work. So without taking up any more time, I'm going to hand over to Kim Catcheside and thank her very much for chairing this event for us today.
Everybody. I mean, it falls to me just to give you a little bit of an idea about what's going to be happening this afternoon. The background on what we're going to be talking about during the general election last year and in the months following. I think the experience of the Canadian debt reduction programme in the mid-90s was much called upon as a potential template for UK policy. Debt was reduced by 20% in the few years following 1995 in Canada, and it remains to be seen whether a similar trajectory can be achieved here. This afternoon we'll be interrogating the arguments behind public spending cuts, and with the help of our panel, we will be helping you to ask questions and hearing from you later on as well. The Barrow Cadbury Trust are very pleased to have enticed Michael Mendelson, our keynote speaker, to tell us more about the Canadian experience. He'll speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll hear more briefly from the rest of our panellists. Sir Stuart Etherington, Chief Executive of the National Council for Voluntary Organisations, Julian McRae, Director of Research at the Institute of Government, Kitty Usher, former Minister in the DWP and the Treasury, who's now Director at Demos, and Stephen Allen Brittas, Leader of Merton Council. If I could then first, with great pleasure, introduce Michael Mendelson, who is Senior Scholar at the Caledon Institute of Social Policy in Canada, formerly the Deputy Secretary of Cabinet Office in Ontario, one of the many senior positions held in various Canadian administrations over the years. He told us just before we arrived that he is no stranger in cutting spending during recession, having presided over the biggest ever deficit reduction he thinks probably in Canada, in Ontario, during the recession of the early 90s. Please welcome Michael Mendelson.
Thank you very much. I will speak from the podium, and these are on, I take it. I'm not going to entertain you with a PowerPoint. I'm using the PowerPoint only to display the graphs because they're a lot easier to see that way. But you all have copies of this paper. I take it in your packages. I say to people it's very short and there's lots of pictures. So you can always read the paper. Now, being in Britain, you're all familiar with Shakespeare and with the tremendous speech in Julius Caesar where Antony says, I've come to bury Caesar and not to praise him. Well, in the same spirit, I've come to talk about Canada and not the UK. So let me tell you a little bit about what happened in Canada. This is a picture of net government debt in Canada as a percent of GDP over time. For those of you familiar with economic history, you'll know that in the early 70s, the final deterioration of the Bretton Woods Agreement occurred, and many countries in the Western world suffered deteriorating fiscal circumstances as a result, and Canada was one of them. Beginning at about that point in time, we had a gradual run-up in the debt, which you can see on the chart here. And then in each recessionary period, as it was in 81, 82, it picked up a little more. And again, in the recession, 89 to 91. Finally, in the mid-90s, we had reached about 71% of GDP in respect of debt. Now, by the way, for those who are economists, that's not the world's greatest measure as a percent of GDP, because one is stock and the other is flow, but we don't need to get into the details. In essence, this is not a great situation. The Wall Street Journal was writing articles about Canada and what how it was going to become the Mexico of the North and do all sorts of bad things to people who lent us money. So a consensus had been developing that something had to be done. In November 1993, a new government was elected, a Liberal government under Jean Chrétien, with a new finance minister, Paul Martin. And they put the first budget on the table in February of 1994. These dates are important. February 1994, the first glimmers of Canada's exit from the recession were beginning to show, but not much. The budget their first budget in 94 had some militant rhetoric about the budget, but the moves that the actual measures that were undertaken were pretty minor. And in fact, in many ways, it very much resembled all the preceding budgets under the previous Conservative government in making a lot of noise about the deficit, but really not doing all that much about it. And there's good reason why it resembled that previous government's budget. If you've ever been involved in actually writing a government budget, you know that the essence of it is really completed a couple of months before it becomes public. So when a new government gets elected in November and puts a budget out in the public in February, it's about 90% the previous government's budget and about 10% the new government's budget. So the first real, truly liberal budget of the new Chrétien-Martin government was actually in February 1995. And that budget also contained militant rhetoric about the deficit, except this time it had a difference in that they actually did something about it. There were significant reductions in central government, in government operations, as well as planned reductions in transfers to the provinces and in unemployment insurance program and in other programs. Now, the thing about 1995 is that Canada had finally emerged from the recession of 1981, 89, 93. And Canada, for a variety of reasons peculiar to our specific situation, like a property bubble in Toronto that burst, had suffered quite significantly in that recession, 89 through 93. We had about almost a 4% drop in GDP, which is quite large, although not as large as the 2008 recession here. It was generally harder, that recession in Canada, than most other countries. One of the countries that had a very shallow recession in the early 90s was the United States, which had less than a 2% drop in GDP. And in fact, by 92, the US was emerging very strongly from the recession. In 93 and 94, much more so. So by 1994, Canada had begun to catch that wave, if I can use the metaphor. About 400,000 new jobs in Canada had been created, and private sector employment was going up rapidly. So in 1995, when the Chrétien government issued its first budget, its first real budget of its own, the Prime Minister was cited in the budget as saying the time to cut deficits is when the economy is growing, and now is the time, because the economy was growing very rapidly. The fiscal consolidation occurred over the next 3 fiscal years. And we went from here is a picture in figure 2 of deficits and surplus. When it's below the zero line, that means it's a deficit. When it's above, that means it's a surplus. And we went from deficits of about 37 billion was where we started, to the first fiscal year, sorry, here was the first big fiscal year of cuts, to about 30 billion, and I've lost my pointer, to, sorry, about 30 billion here, then 10 billion or so here, and then a surplus. These were the effects. There's a bit of a lag for these. It's about a 1-year lag before the reductions actually take effect. But the Martin 3 years of fiscal constraint essentially set Canada up for a series of surpluses which were sustained for the next many years, decade and a half actually, until the current recession. Now, it turns out that when you look at fiscal consolidations in developed countries, there aren't many of them. And there are even fewer that were successful. The OECD, in one OECD study, there's few OECD studies, they found, I believe, 6 examples of fiscal consolidations of more than 8% of GDP, only 6. And 2 of those were in Sweden, One of them was in Greece, one was in Portugal. I'm not sure exactly how to count those. And one of them was in Canada. So they're fairly rare occurrences to have been successful. And I think that they're even rarer, obviously, to have been sustained through time. It's one thing to make a reduction and then to evince such a negative reaction that everything goes back to the trend line that was on previously. So a sustainable fiscal reduction is a rarity and worthy of study. And therefore, I think it is reasonable to look at what happened in Canada. And in fact, in the UK, Canada was looked at carefully, but mainly from the point of view of mechanics. Well, how did you do this? And that's interesting, and having been in government myself, and those of you who've also been in government know that there are a lot of ways to do it. You know that song by Paul Simon, there's 50 ways. And I'm sure that there are 50 ways to cut a budget. You can have a star chamber like Paul Martin did, or you can get everybody together for a lost weekend and cut budgets in many ways. To me, the mechanics are interesting and useful to learn about, but that's not really what makes the Canadian experience, what defines it as having been successful. In my view, what defines it as being successful are the economic conditions under which it occurred. So Canada initiated its fiscal consolidation in a period of very significant economic growth in its neighbor to the south, in the United States. And at the time, about 85% of Canada's exports were to the United States. Our dollar at the time had fallen to about, if I remember correctly, about 67 cents to the US dollar. And just to give you a comparison, it's now about $1.03, or at least it was when I last looked, about $1.03 to the US dollar. So 63 cents is quite a devaluation. It was about the lowest it had been since the Second World War. So that means that our exports were pretty easy to place into the United States, especially in a period of boom. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. This shows you a picture of exports as a share of nominal GDP in Canada, and you can see, if I can find the line here, 92, this is the recessionary period in the United States. The United States starts recovering in 92, and our exports start going up, 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 and still up, really until about 2000. So this period of 94 through to, here's the period of fiscal consolidation. So what this meant was that private sector employment was rapidly expanding in the period of fiscal consolidation, and allowed for the substitution, essentially, of the of private sector employment for the public sector employment that was lost. In this slide, I just created a very simple index from 1989 of public sector employment, private sector employment, and total employment. And you can see the red line is public sector employment, and when you start applying fiscal constraints, it means that public sector employment will fall. I suspect it's the same as in the UK and Canada. Other than transfer payments to individuals, about 80% of the cost of services is wages. So if you're going to cut government services, you will have to reduce government employment. But at the same time as the red line is falling, the green line, the yellow line, private sector, as you can see, private sector employment is rising very quickly. Consequently, we never had a situation in which employment was falling. Employment was always increasing. During the period of extreme fiscal constraint, it was pretty flat, but it wasn't falling. And again, for those of you in the government sector who've been involved in budget making, you'll know that it's really employment that tells you. The unemployment number that you hear about, the top line, 7%, 6%, is a really important social statistic. But if you want to know what's going to happen to government revenue, look at the employment figure. That's where you'll really, really see what's happening. So this was very important, and it meant that the effects of the reductions were significantly absorbed by the private sector, and the economy as a whole felt pretty robust during this whole period, with employment growth, revenue going up, expenditure constraints under control. Of course, the deficit was going down quite rapidly, and in fact, as you saw in the previous chart, it was eliminated within 3 years. That's what you'd expect. But there was another contribution to both the economic well-being of Canada in this period, as well as to, very significantly, the reduction in the deficit. And that was through monetary policy. We started with very high payments on public debt. In fact, at the highest point, public debt charges were taking up about 35% of the federal government's total budget, which is a kind of scary figure. And we were paying pretty significant interest rates, not necessarily because of a Canadian premium. There was no realistic fear of a Canadian default. We'd probably have to go to super Italian to 200% of GDP before there'd be concerns about a Canadian default. But there was a slight premium being paid just because we were swamping the market continuously with Canadian paper, and the Canadian, the equivalent of Gelt's Canadian treasuries, and also interest rates were quite high in the early 90s. By the end of the period, debt charges had fallen very significantly, and in fact, in my calculations, about $17 to $18 billion was saved in debt servicing charges just as a result of the decrease in interest rates alone. So if you start off by thinking about the total gap in that had to be filled, and for those there will be a test. For those of you who recall, it was about $37 billion. So a $17 or $18 billion contribution through interest rate decline is quite significant. Just as importantly, because monetary policy was able to rapidly loosen in Canada, because we started from a high point, that contributed as well to the growth of the Canadian economy, and it helped to offset the effects of the constraint quite significantly. So I'm going to conclude and do what I said I wasn't going to do. I'm just going to talk about the UK for a bit. Oh, I included here in my paper, I didn't put down the US, but I couldn't resist showing the US as well. This is net general government debt. This includes, by the way, local debt, everything that you can call as government debt that you can find on a national accounts basis, it's called, is in Canada, the UK, and the United States. The red line is the path of debt in Canada, and the green line is the path of debt in the United States, and the yellow line is the UK. So what can we say about the UK's experience compared to Canada? One thing we know is that the UK economy is not in the midst of an economic boom. In fact, it seems to be in the midst of somewhat of a period of stagnation. It's hard to see how monetary policy can contribute significantly to a more robust economy in the UK, because you're already at 0.5 or so, and for those who follow this, your 10-year certificates, bonds, gilts they're called here, are I think about 3.8% now on auction. So it's not going to get much lower. So you're not in a situation where you're going to find the same kind of savings that we found through monetary policy. Your export markets are pretty hard to see how they're going to absorb the excess capacity created by government constraints. Your main export markets, United States, Ireland, continental Europe isn't doing too badly. But certainly Ireland and the United States are not about to become big new importers. Of course, there's other possibilities in Asia and so on, but it doesn't look so good. I think the last report was that the UK had the highest deficit on current account with China this month than it had previously, not the other way around. So the economic conditions don't appear to be the same. As well, when I looked at the UK, when I looked at this chart of the UK's debt circumstances, and admittedly this is not an in-depth perspective, it's top-of-the-line perspective, a few things struck me. One is that you've previously gone through a period of fiscal constraint here. And if you want an example of when I talk about a sustainable change in fiscal circumstances, this is an example of a non-sustainable change in fiscal circumstances. It's easy, I mean, easy isn't the right word. It's possible to make cuts, but they have to be done in such a way that they create a stable, fiscal circumstance, a stable political circumstance, and a sustainable public sector that can deliver the kinds of goods and services that people require and anticipate in a modern state. That was one thing that occurred to me. Another question that I had, and there are experts on the panel who will tell me that I'm wrong, but if we see Canada's gradual buildup of debt, it's pretty clear that Canada had a structural deficit. The UK's had an increase in debt over the 2000s that, to me, I'm a Keynesian, you might have guessed, and that means you have to accept both sides of the coin. It means that during periods of economic growth, you need to accept that you will be restraining the growth in debt, and that didn't happen in the 2000s, and it probably should have. This little line here, instead of going up, probably should have gone down. But the truth is that it wouldn't have made that much difference, and it wasn't an extraordinary accelerating increase. The acceleration took place once the recession hit. Now I'm told that that has permanently knocked production out of the UK productive capacity. I don't know if that's true or not, but to me it looks like somewhat of it doesn't have the same pattern as Canada's. It looks to me of a more transient nature, and one would have to analyze the extent to which it is a phenomena, a transient phenomena of the recession or not. In any case, I suppose what I am saying is that in Canada's case, the real lesson is about timing. You know, there's a joke about comedy, but it takes two people to, what's the essence of comedy? Timing, but it takes two people to tell the joke. But you've all heard it, so you can, for those who haven't heard it, ask your neighbor. The essence of what the real lesson from Canada is that the essence of fiscal reduction is timing. If you are looking at a permanent change in fiscal circumstances that will allow for a sustainable public sector. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That raises plenty of questions, and we will be taking questions at the end. We'll be having roving mics, and you'll have plenty of opportunity. But we're just going to hear from our panellists now. If I could introduce, first of all, Sir Stuart Etherington, who is Chief Executive of the National Council for Voluntary Organisations. Unfortunately, Sir Stuart can't stay for questions, so he'll be going off at about 4 o'clock for another urgent appointment.
Thank you very much. Well, I was reflecting as Michael was talking. I mean, what an excellent summary paper this is. I found it extraordinarily helpful. I was reflecting on whatever happened to optimism. Was my thesis, really. It is pretty doom and gloom stuff. And I just want to reflect on two things. One, in relation to the data that Michael's provided, which I think is very revealing about why the UK experience is not the same as the Canadian experience. And I think it's explained very well. I'm not an economist, so I can't start my speech by saying as an economist. It's strange, isn't it? Economists always start their speeches by saying as an economist. As a former social worker, I'd like to reflect on what's going on here. But I also want to argue a second point, really, which doesn't really emerge from Michael's paper, because not because he hasn't thought about it, I suspect, because he just hasn't mentioned it, which is that I think what's going on here in the UK has an ideological element which is absent also from the Canadian experience, and I just want to reflect a little bit about on that. I think Michael's explanation is pretty clear, really, that the crisis was clearly different. It clearly had a different basis. Our crisis was only in part structural, but was mainly to do with financial services. And one of the interesting things about differential growth rates that we're now seeing across the European Union is that those who seem to be doing more successfully are those that have more balanced economies than the UK had become over a very strong period of time. We are growing at about, 0.5%, the last thing, against Germany at 1.5%, who retain quite a significant manufacturing base and a significant high technology manufacturing base. So I think the basis of the crisis was somewhat different, and the solutions may be different too. But again, I mean, I suppose the most important point that you make in your thesis, Michael, is that there was growth occurring against the background of this sort of fiscal deficit, and that actually the ability of the private sector to pick up the slack and to drive growth in this environment was much greater than it would appear to be the case in the United Kingdom at the moment. There is an assumption that the private sector will grow and pick up the slack, which has been caused by, if you like, the public sector employees will suddenly develop an amazing set of skills that we didn't know they had, and be picked up in the private sector in some way that I don't fully understand, but I'm sure others will tell me that it's easy to do. And I also think the other thing that is absent from the Canadian experience, and is true of the United Kingdom, is the relative effect of the European Union. You have the United States to yourself, the European Union, which we're part of, continental Europe to our east. And there, I think, the impact of the Eurozone and what is happening there will be more significant, I think, than, and will tell a slightly different story in relation to UK patterns of growth. But what I also want to just flag up is that I think the way in which the government is approaching this is not purely from an economic point of view. I think there's a strong ideological proposition about the role of the state, which I didn't get a sense of from your description of the Canadian experience. It may well be there, but I didn't get a real sense of it, that these people were very sceptical about the role of the state in actually intervening in some major public policy issues. Now, that may be true, but I didn't get a sense of that. It seemed to me that the Canadian experience was, at one level, wanting to restore the growth necessary to deliver what were essentially agreed would be publicly delivered services in one way or another. I think what we're seeing here is a slightly different argument and a serious questioning of whether or not public service or public sector solutions are what the government sees as desirable, and hence the if you like, the ideological underpinning of what has become known as the big society agenda. If anybody still uses that term at the moment, I think they probably do. But nevertheless, that's an underpinning of a serious concern being expressed by government about the role of the public sector, which I don't see in the analysis, and I think it's a different one. What are the elements of that big society agenda? Well, it's all pretty clear now. 3 elements. One is about wanting citizens to do more in relation to the delivery of services in terms of giving of time and money, social investment. Some sort of decentralisation agenda, which I was quite sort of buoyant about the decentralisation agenda for a while, the transfer of responsibilities to local authorities, the freeing up of local government, till I was told yesterday that the so-called localism bill accrues 149 new powers to the Secretary of State to tell local government what they can do. It's a remarkable description of localism. So local authorities can now do exactly what they like, except for the 149 times that the Secretary of State can tell them what to do. I think we should know what those 149 issues are. We, of course, with our colleagues in Kivo and NAVCA have added another one, which they mustn't cut the voluntary sector disproportionately, such as our enormous support for the notion of localism. So there is a localist agenda. I'll be interested to see how that flows out. But most important, I think, is the public service reform agenda. Whether that will mean increased contracting out, whether the interest that the government appears to be showing towards mutualisation and corporatisation is real, or whether this is really just camouflage for privatisation. Work programme contracting would suggest that the private sector is going to play a much more prominent role in relation to this, and be interesting to see how that plays out in relation to other services. I mean, the clearly battleground now is the NHS, and what actually happens if anybody's listening to the listening exercise, what exactly happens in that period. I think 2 other observations, really. One is, one of the things that I did observe in Canada when I was there during part of this period was the enormous focus on innovation, both in terms of the private sector, but also in terms of public sector innovation, which I think is going to be a more characteristic thing that we might well observe in the UK. But I don't know really what happened to the sort of what we might term the fairness agenda, which seems to bubble up a little bit in the UK and then pretty quickly scurries away again. And I think that tension between the desire for citizens to do more independently, but on the other hand, to try and run a fairness agenda against that strikes me as quite a tricky thing to achieve. So in summary, I think the economic circumstances are different in the United Kingdom. The solutions that Canada adopted, I think, are less likely to be effective in the United Kingdom simply because we don't have an underpinning growth that seemed to be able to drive some of this. And just really my point is that I think there's slightly more of an ideological driver than I detected in Canada at the time that this was happening, although subsequently there might have been. I hope that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Stuart. That's extremely helpful. And I perhaps would like to propose a new indicator, an Etherington indicator, because having listened to you quite a lot since the last election, it seems to me that perhaps in terms of optimism, the graph does seem to be taking a bit of a downward turn.
Is it up or down?
Anyway, if I could introduce our next speaker, Kitty Usher, who is Director of Demos now. She was formerly a Minister at the Treasury and the DWP, and so I'm sure that she has a lot to reflect upon.
Well, thanks very much, Kim, and to Barrow Cadbury Trust for inviting me and putting this together. When faced with the choice of how to introduce oneself, I find myself, although I am given a former minister, feeling that whatever the image of economists, perhaps having been the Minister for Banks who took office when everything was fine and left when everything had collapsed, that perhaps it's preferable to introduce myself as a former economist, which has perhaps some sort of greater kudos, given my personal role clearly in causing the global financial collapse. In fact, some former comrades of mine in the Labour Party commented, teased me as we're going through the lobbies in around June 2007. Oh yes, Kitty, did you join the Labour Party in order to be Minister for the City? And since this is the time when the City seemed to be doing rather well, at least on the front pages, even though there are some little warning signals creeping through the business pages by that point, I found to shut them up what I would say is that my job was to earn the trust of the City in order to destroy it from within. So job done there then. And what I wanted to do now is perhaps give a few reflections on what we've heard so far, and start perhaps with trying to nail maybe a couple of myths that are floating around the place. Overall, though, I think all on the panel are probably going to violently agree that the situation in the UK is certainly different from that in Canada, in that, of course, we are not cutting against a background of economic growth, which would have made life far easier. I think the point of contention is whether that economic growth at this stage, in early 2011, when the cuts really begin to bite, was ever possible to have created. And this is where we're seeing the differences between Labour and the Tories in the way that they are attempting to characterise the current situation. First of all, just a couple of sort of points of fact. I think I agreed with everything that Sir Stuart said, and I'm intrigued by the idea of the Etherington Index starting to point downwards. One point that I think we do need to understand, though, is what is going on in terms of the exposure that the UK economy had to the recession compared to other, say, European countries that had a smaller proportion of their economy in financial services. Actually, if you look at the facts, there is no correlation at all between the severity of the recession and the proportion of the economy that is in financial services. In fact, Germany's recession, in terms of actual proportion of economic loss, in terms of proportion, the extent to which the economy shrank, proportion of GDP that was lost, Germany's recession was actually deeper than ours, even though we have a far greater proportion of our economy in financial services. And if you look across the globe as a whole, what's very clear is that economic output actually contracted because of the contraction in demand in the real economy that was precipitated by the financial services contraction in some parts of the world, but the ripple effects in terms of confidence and therefore fall in consumer demand was what really caused the recession, rather than the existence within a geographic boundary of a financial services sector. But of course Germany, and everyone's talking about Germany at the moment, is growing faster now, which takes me back to the first point, that the real debate is, could Britain have grown faster in 2010, 2011, 2012 as compared to what we're currently seeing in terms of our emergence from that recession. The other point, and I sort of feel as if, you know, kind of I'm on a bit of a crusade to make this point, and I'm delighted that Michael has left this last slide up, because he made his point very, very clearly about what should have happened to the UK, where Julian's just pointed this one out to me. What seems to have happened during the Lawson boom is, like the good Keynesian that Lawson was, he's extracted the tax surplus from the economy, which is why debt falls quite dramatically, and did quite well out of North Sea oil receipts and so on during the boom. So debt falls because the economy is growing. One might say it was growing unsustainably, which is why we then had a bust in the early 1990s. So if Gordon Brown had been a good Keynesian, then you should have expected the yellow line to go down in the boom, or certainly sort of long period of economic expansion that was going up to about 2007, 2008. The fact that it goes up afterwards is as a result of the recession. So it's the automatic stabilizers kicking in terms of benefit payments, and it's the lack of receipts primarily from the financial services sector and then throughout the whole of corporate Britain as the recession kicks in. The point I feel that needs to be understood is that even if Brown had made that line, the yellow line, go more sharply downwards, it would not either have prevented the recession nor prevented debt going through the arbitrary threshold of 40% that the government had established for itself as one of its golden rules. In fact, given that the stock of debt is expected to go to 70 or 80% of GDP from about 38, you do the maths, you would have had to have it all the way down to zero or even below in order to make sure that the sort of political construct of the golden rule wasn't breached. So whilst there might have been a more perfect economic policy in terms of the government balancing what was going on in the private sector, the fact that it wasn't completely perfect didn't cause the problems. The problems arose elsewhere and caused the pile-up of debt. But the main point that I want to make is to hark back to Roosevelt in the 1930s when he said, and this quote is well known, that the main thing we have to fear is fear itself. The point that I want to make is that the economy was recovering in the beginning of 2010, about this time last year, and then something started to happen over the summer that spooked people. And my argument is that it was actually the ramping up of the political rhetoric rather than the actual implementation of the cuts that has caused the current sort of stagnation of GDP growth at the moment. And I'll just give you a couple of facts taken from consumer confidence indicators to make this point. Nationwide does consumer confidence indicators and also ask people how likely they are to spend in the next 6 months. And I'll just give you both of them. In March 2010, their consumer confidence indicator was 73. Okay. February 2011, February's just gone, it had gone all the way down to 39. So in the last year, consumers have got dramatically less confident. Now, it ticked up again in March to 44, which hopefully is the beginning of a recovery. The answer to the question, how likely are you to spend money in the next 6 months? March 2010, the index was at 98. It rose through the election, through the emergency budget, to peak at 102 in August last year. Last summer, it's peaked at 102. By February this year, it's 53, and just ticked up again to 66 in March. If you look at GfK opinion polls on consumer confidence, April this year, so this is the most recent figures, it was minus 31, down even further from April last year, which is minus 16, and the lowest since mid-2008. Mid-2008 is when we all went, need to pay off my mortgage, need to pay off my credit card, and it's lower than there. Well, actually roughly at the same sort of level as there. So we're feeling deeply unconfident, and that is something that started in the third quarter of last year. Now, I think this is important because the cuts hadn't begun to bite then. They hadn't even been announced. All we had was a new government coming in going, we've got to make sure we're not Greece, and the problem is enormous. And we've had this note left by Liam Byrne to say there is no money and everything was, a complete disaster. That is what we had over last summer. And I don't know how it felt like in your sort of private household life, but it felt to me like everyone was going, there's cuts coming and I don't know whether I'm going to be affected or not. That, I think, is what happened in the British economy, because the public sector workers didn't start losing their jobs until, 1st of April this year. And so it was the fear of it that actually caused us to decide not to move house, not to buy that thing we wanted to buy, and it's that led to a fallback in consumer demand. Now, why is that important? Because in Britain, consumer confidence is higher than the global average, 65.3% of the economy. I think the global average is about 62, a bit higher in America. So if consumers aren't feeling confident, it doesn't matter whether we have a huge rebalancing back towards manufacturing if people aren't going to go and buy their televisions. And as both Michael and Sir Stuart have said, with some of our trading partners not exactly going through the roof at the moment, we can't expect exports to take the slack. So the main point that I'm wanting to make is there wasn't much, something at the margins, that the last government could have done to have prevented the recession. But there is quite a lot that is contested in terms of how we emerge from that. And I've just got a quote that the Prime Minister said after the last growth figures, which showed GDP up by 0.5%, which was hailed as a great success. He said, what is encouraging in the figures is that the British economy is growing again, absolutely. Manufacturing is up, yup. Exports are up, great. And we are seeing a rebalancing of the economy, so we are not over-reliant on private consumption. That is manifestly, unfortunately, not true, because although manufacturing is up, it's still lower than at its peak a few years ago, and even the service sector is still lower. The private service sector is still lower than its peak a few years ago. So it's not true that there's been some kind of rebalancing, and in fact a little bit more private consumption in order to create the conditions where cuts can take place in a way that doesn't push us or push confidence down might actually be a rather good thing. Now, the hope is that now that the cuts are actually taking place, this thing might work its way through quite quickly, and we might see consumer confidence rebounding later in the year. And indeed, retail sales, although bad, are not quite as disastrous a picture as confidence might suggest. But we've got a long way before the house prices start booming again. So hopefully, things will start to stabilise quite soon. Just a couple of sort of thoughts for the future. And I don't have the answer for this. Michael mentioned in passing the question as to whether this was a permanent structural sort of shift in the UK economy. And the point I'd like to make is that we won't know this until many years after the event. We don't actually know the extent of the structural as opposed to cyclical deficit. And in fact, these things get revised every 3 or 4 years retrospectively. The government, however, is basing its cuts on an actual sort of snapshot of what the structural deficit is. So it says it's this number of billions and we're going to eliminate it, therefore we're going to make this number of people redundant. And so it may be the case after the event that it will be revised and that amount of pain either was not enough or was sort of far over the top. And the final point to make, we haven't had it in this discussion, but I would say before making a final conclusion on the merits or not of the Canadian versus the UK experiences, we need to understand what the real effect was on people, on life expectancy, on hospital waiting lists, on school achievements and so on. And that, I would say, is the real way it should be judged. Thanks, Kim.
Thank you. And if I now introduce Julian McRae, who's Director of Research at the Institute for Government, formerly Deputy Director of the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit under the last administration.
Good afternoon. I'd like to start by, first of all, saying that the points that Michael made are, I think, exactly right. If you look at any of the large consolidations that have taken place, they've done so into growing economies. It's not quite the defining feature, but just what the UK is trying to do, if we don't see a rapidly growing economy over the next few years, will be unique. And George Osborne will no doubt then be touring the world, telling people how exactly he achieved this never-before-achieved ambition. That said, I want to just try not to agree too much, because I do agree completely with that, and raise a couple of questions. First of all, the slight question of, are we looking at the right country here? Are there other people we might look at, and which explains some of what's going on in the UK context? I'm interested in the process. At the Institute for Government, we do processes of government more than policies of government. So Michael skipped lightly over the fact that the Canadian process had certain elements to it. I think they're quite important for the contrast with the UK. And then finally, I want to share with you my favourite irony, I think, of what's going on at the moment, but I'll hold that to the end. Right country. Absolutely right. If you look at Canada, it's a very long-term problem that Canada has. It picks its time in some way. And actually, if you look at those 20 years of rising debt in Canada, you'll find there are quite a few attempts by governments to cut the deficit before the one that is seen as the successful attempt, which is into a strongly growing economy. So that might tell you something. It's also quite obvious that they take their time getting into this deficit reduction. The election is about 18 months before the budget, which is setting up this, and there's a lot of planning process that goes into designing these cuts. If you look at what happened in the UK, we look a lot more like Sweden. in the 1990s. Now, Sweden in the 1990s had a genuine crisis. They were borrowing at about 4 percentage points above German interest rates, and they were finding it very difficult to actually borrow. So the finance minister at the time tours the world, literally talking to the 25-year-old brokers in Washington, in New York and in London, trying to convince them that his country is fine, and they're telling him, well, why don't you cut your benefit rates? Which is a very difficult position if you're the elected minister. They move very, very quickly to introduce a set of cuts and reductions. Now, I'm not saying which country is right or wrong here, because it's a matter of opinion. If you look at where this government is coming from, this government compares the UK to Greece and implicitly to Sweden. It uses rhetoric like on the brink of bankruptcy. It is implicitly saying we have adopted an approach to deficit reduction which was the appropriate approach for an impending crisis. And therefore we had to move extremely fast, and there are consequences of doing that in how you go about the reduction. Now, so then, just a question, right country. You can take your own views as to where we were at the time and what would be the appropriate way to go about it. Right process, going back to Canada, one of the things that I think is very striking about the Canadian experience when it did deficit reduction, it planned it in quite a systematic way round a collaborative approach to this. Or consensual is probably too strong a word, because there's generally not consensus in these processes. People generally don't like what has to happen. But one part of it was to, one, convince the public that something was necessary. Now, in a sense, they had an easier task. If you look at the opinion polls and the degree to which people were focused on debt reduction in Canada, it tends to rise gradually over that 20-year period till it's a very large political issue by the time of the early 1990s. In the UK, we haven't had a focus on our fiscal situation spreading over 20 years. It's a very new phenomenon, and it's very, very poorly understood in people's minds as to exactly what is this problem that we're supposed to face. This government has actually done very well on achieving a consensus around there being a necessary problem. Going back to some of what Kitty was talking about, spent a lot of time talking about there is a looming problem, there is something very large here. The second part, I mean, if you look at successful consolidation, they tend to have their own internal narrative going on, which reflects around fairness, which is the second part. And you will have noticed last year there was a lot of conversation about fairness coming from the Chancellor. It's quite an interesting concept, fairness, in a consolidation. It's certainly not very simple income distribution charts. Where does the money go? I started my career working at the IFS and therefore produced loads of income distribution charts, which I now believe are totally irrelevant to most problems, but that's only because I've moved on. The notions of fairness tend to be about what do you think your country's about. So in Sweden, when they're doing their consolidation, they're talking a lot about the future. So when they're doing cuts to the benefit system, which they have to do because that's where most of their money is going, and it's fairly easy money to take out from an administrative point of view, what they talk about is we have to do this so we can save the money that's going on children's education in schools. The narrative being, well, you can make up in later life for living in a household that hasn't got lots of money, but you can never get a second chance at education. So the narrative is very strong, and it's constructed around the choices, the whole totality of the choices. In Canada, they spend a long time trying to think about how do these packages of cuts fit together so that there's a narrative about the future of Canada. In the UK, if you look again at the polling, we don't generally accept some of the acceptance of that this is a fair process is much, much lower than this is necessary. Now, that question, have we, because we moved very quickly to actually adopt a set of policies, have we spent the time that is necessary to implement those policies on building up the political consensus these things are right? So if you look at you can see various examples very quickly on these. If you look at Building Schools for a Future, when Michael Gove came out and said, actually, we're going to cut back on this school building programme, deeply unpopular, not balanced by a narrative of I'm going to cut the capital spend because I've got to preserve the teachers in the classrooms, so the classrooms are a bit shoddy, which would have been, you might think, an argument you would make in that context. It was an argument of the last government was useless at procurement. which is fine for things where it's waste and invisible things to the public. It's not a decent argument when you're actually cutting things that are about their kids and their families. And similarly, it was about procurement processes were weak. Again, a technical argument that just doesn't work when you're talking to people about what does this mean going forward. Surely it's you as a politician's job to sort this technical stuff out. So there's been a sense of that on the way in. You can look at forests earlier this year, again, a freestanding set of choices which didn't have a political constituency behind it, wasn't mentioned in the spending review, not seen structurally part of that. The question is how much of the rest of this package hangs together in the public's mind is a necessary set of actions that makes some sense against some rationale. It may be necessary, but is it the right thing to do? The third thing that I'd like to just touch on briefly is just the sort of, there is, in a sense, it's very easy to underestimate what we're trying to do in terms of scale and challenge in the UK. And I say that knowing that we're attempting the largest fiscal consolidation that really this country has ever undertaken. You can look back at the 1920s, but it's a very different world, the 1920s from today. We're not just doing that. The scale of public sector reform is an order of magnitude greater than anything we've really tried. The health service reforms were the biggest package of health service reforms very easily, arguably, since 1948. If you look at what we're doing at the welfare system, moving to a universal credit will be, again, one of the biggest reforms in a generation to our welfare system. Those are our two biggest spend areas in government. You can look across the range of policies and you will see individually big challenges there. You can also look at the rhetoric and some of the actions of the Prime Minister. We want to change the entire way government operates. The Prime Minister talks about turning government on its head. Now, there are two sets of arguments here. One set of arguments says, look, this is absolutely necessary. This is totally essential to achieving the consolidation cut. So these aren't one ambition laid on top of another. These are actually the things that make both sides of this work together. If you look at a lot of the consolidations that have actually taken place, you find, particularly Sweden, where they explicitly said, look, we didn't do any transformation. We didn't design it at the top and push it down into the system. Or what we did was take cash out where we could because we were in a crisis. We had to move fast. We couldn't take the additional risk of having those big changes because big change programs are very risky. They tend to, private sector statistics, you can argue about these, but only about a third of private sector schemes we are intending to save large amounts of money in a business actually succeed in saving that amount of money. Inherently, these are very risky. And you've seen clearly with the health reforms that some of that risk can be realised. And at the moment, we have a policy process which is causing big problems in the NHS. If you think that the NHS, the spending settlement for the NHS is the toughest since the 1950s for them to meet anyway, a large change programme on top of that which pauses halfway through, or halfway through its planning phase, is adding to your overall risk. Now, the Prime Minister's argument, as you well know, is that the two things go together. The reform and the savings go together. You can't do one without the other. But certainly if you look at some of the international experience of this, it's not so clear-cut. The final point is the irony in all this. In a sense, we've had a government that talks a lot about the fact that there is a large degree of waste and inefficiency inside government. That may or may not be true. There's certainly waste and inefficiency inside government. There's waste and inefficiency inside large private sector organisations as well. You can argue about the relative sizes of those. The issue is how do you get that waste and inefficiency out rather than whether it exists or not for these processes. Now, somewhere along the line, the government presumably believes that the set of public sector managers and people in place who've been running these organisations have been ineffective, and they've allowed this large amount of waste to grow up, and therefore a scale of challenge is necessary. This massive reform programme is necessary to actually drive that waste out. The sort of irony in this is that the same people are still running the public sector. It's the same civil servants in Whitehall. It's the same managers in the NHS. It's the same people running local authorities. There's a sort of irony as to what the government believes about the public sector. Because in some of its rhetoric, you might think it believes the public sector is not all that good. But in the plans that it's laid out, it believes implicitly that the public sector is capable of achieving a feat of change and fiscal consolidation that no private sector firm would ever willingly, in any way, shape or form, go near, because they'd know the risks in this were far too large. So it must implicitly believe that public sector management is at least on a par with the very best in the private sector. I leave you to sort of reflect on which you think is true there about public sector management. But put it this way, George Osborne probably has staked his career on the latter being true. Thank you.
And let's see if he thanks the public sector if they pull it off. Our next speaker this afternoon is Stephen Allen Brittis, who's leader of Merton Council, and as former head of public affairs at the Federation of Small Businesses, is probably pretty qualified to answer that last question.
Thank you, Kim. Yes, there is an awful lot of expectations on the private sector, and I do believe that the private sector can deliver, but it's all about speed and the avoidance of splurges, but I'll get on to that at the end. But I want to thank the Barrow Cadbury Fund for this initiative. Michael spoke about how in Canada there was a reduction in transfers to provinces. Here in the UK, we would talk about cuts in grant funding to local authorities. Now, one such local authority, taking the media analogy, that is to illustrate a generality, you home in on an individual case. So one such local authority is my local authority, the London Borough of Merton, an outer London hamlet, not a Hackney or a Tower Hamlets or a Camden, but nevertheless a good example of a local authority that is a four-star authority, that is doing well and caught by the maelstrom of the changes. A £500 million spend, 200,000 residents, 80,000 households, 3,000 staff. Already sharing services to save money. We share our HR with Liberal Democrat Sutton. We share our legal departments with Conservative Richmond. So we didn't need Eric Pickles to tell us to share. We were sharing well before one of his edicts. Now, the issue with the London Borough of Merton is the difficulty is there is a 30% increase in demand for primary school places. So primary schools, very expensive to put in place. The first edict we received from Eric Pickles was that we had to publicise everything we spent above £500, and we do that, and we were one of the first local authorities to do it. But the cuts have come in. They've come in a big way, 30% over the next 4 years. We have to find 70 million. For 2011-2012, the budget just gone, which was passed without histrionics or protests, 30% cut in our funding from government, and that meant I had to find, and my officers had to find £24 million of savings, as they're called. Julian spoke about fairness. We addressed our values as a local authority. There was 27% cut in the CEO's office, 15% in environment, just 7% in adult social services and 3% in children's. Now, time is of the essence, and that was a really, really rushed exercise. And we've lost 222 staff, costing us £3 million, paid a national average of £15,000 per member of staff. So this is just one local authority, put together all 300 local authorities, and the loss of staff to the public sector, 600,000. And it's estimated that the private sector will add another 300,000 job losses, making it near 1 million as a result of the swinging cuts. And I'm not an outlier. Cuts had to take place, and I'll explain where I come from on cuts. So as someone with a business background, I wanted our local authority to be business-like, but in the next 3 years, I have to find another 45 million, and I may have to offload another 750 million staff. And we will be a third smaller as a local authority, down from 3,000 staff to 2,000 staff, and so we have to deal with residents' expectations of what a local authority, a third smaller, can deliver. I'm rushing through this because I sense that we do want to get on to questions, especially to Michael. Now, the threats to local authorities is that local authorities are steeped in a running war with residents over libraries, for example. Luckily, we did not have to close a single library in Merton, but we left that decision till the last minute. Low staff morale, one of the issues I'm concerned about as a result of the splurge and the rush to engage in cuts at speed rather than when the cuts take place, is one of the issues is the demonisation of the public sector. I think that is something that I have to deal with and the directors have to deal with. The public sector has a place to play, as Julian has said, and it's important that we do not demonise it in the way in which some politicians are currently doing that. As you know, Eric Pickles runs the Department for Communities and Local Government. In fact, it's the Department for criticising local government. Finally, another threat is, of course, the move to academies. If schools go academy status, there's less money for local authorities to spend on special educational needs. So what I'm saying is pause, relax, constraint, and see whether we can go through this in a much more business-like manner, as Julian referred to, in terms of a private company would not undertake cuts to its programme on this scale in year one, as it were. Now, finally, there are opportunities to all issues, and as Michael started with a Shakespearean quote, I'd like to finish off with one, and that's from King Lear. King Lear to Cordelia, speak lest you may mar your fortunes. And what this has done, what this push towards cuts, it's made local authorities speak with partners, speak with the voluntary sector, speak with schools, speak with the business community, and that may provide some good at the end of the day. With the voluntary sector, and I'm sorry that Sir Stuart is not here, with the voluntary sector, we were about to cut £650,000 from their budgets. As a result of a compact we engage in, we talked and talked and talked to the voluntary sector, left the decision to the last minute, and that 650,000, as a result of the voluntary sector looking at the way it operated, came down to 250,000. Another of the opportunities is perhaps the relocalisation of the business rates. I have the All England Lawn Tennis Club, no tickets please for Wimbledon. I have the All England Lawn Tennis Club in our borough. They pay business rates of around 3.25 million. I only see 1.5 million of that. The government keeps a huge wodge. So there may be a debate about keeping more of the business rates for local authorities. And with regard to staff, one of the issues that we undertook was a roadshow with all staff, asking them that if they are running a small knit service, fostering adoption, that perhaps they could put their hand up and say that they can run that as a social enterprise. And so we were encouraging that kind of approach from staff. So finally, what I would say is cuts, yes, that had to be entertained, but not at this speed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now have just over half an hour for questions. And if I could just take issue briefly with your accusation that the DCLG is the department for criticising local government, I think you'll find that in all fairness that all departments have a share in that. Right. We have microphones, and the gentleman in the middle there in the blue shirt is first up with his hand. If you could just stand up and say who you are. And apparently I'm advised it's pop star styly with the microphone, so hold it quite close to your lips.
Is that on? Yeah. Toby Bloom from Urban Forum. Thank you. That was really interesting, in particular to understand the similarities and differences at a macro level between Canada and the UK. I'm very interested in the micro. In particular, I'd be really interested to hear the reflections on the experience in Canada on people, in particular more vulnerable groups within society who many of us are committed to supporting. I'd also be interested to hear something about the governance arrangements, particularly as we're debating kind of notions of localism and clearly the relationship between the provinces and the centre in Canada, so we can understand a bit more about the impact.
I'm going to take a couple of questions at a time, actually, as we've got a couple of mics. We've got a mic, another mic down there. Gentleman at the back.
Steve Weiler, I'm from Locality, which is a movement of several hundred community organisations working in some of the most deprived parts of the country. I want to ask two questions, really, about picking up on the theme of fairness that one of the speakers mentioned. In England, the public spending cuts are falling disproportionately on the poorest places and on the most disadvantaged sections of communities. And to some extent, that's inevitable, because that's where public spending is greatest. And it would need determined political leadership to avoid that. We don't see much evidence of that in this country. Was it different in Canada? And the second question is about fairness, is about the banking system. Here in England, the banking bailout was an enormous contributory factor to the financial problems that we face. But that bailout hasn't been accompanied by any real attempt to create a fairer banking system. My organisation, Toby's as well, many others in this room have been campaigning for something equivalent to the Community Reinvestment Act that exists in the United States to create a more equitable, fairer system as part of the bank's licence to operate. It would be really good to know whether in Canada you've found better ways than we have so far to deal with that. Thank you.
I think we'll take two at a time, otherwise you forget the first one. Michael, would you like to open up, first of all, with more detail and then some comments on how far fairness was a motivating factor in Canada?
I thank you for the question. I purposely in my paper didn't get into the details of what happened. It would be wrong to say that it was painless. It wasn't painless. There was significant there were significant disruptions in people's lives in the process of applying the fiscal constraints in Canada. But it was ameliorated in several respects, so I'll talk about some of the amelioration. First of all, when it was undertaken by Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin, who very much were able to present themselves credibly as defending the role of the state, not attacking it. That was part of their orientation and their heritage. Paul Martin's father was one of the central people in introducing our health insurance system, for example. So he, said, this is my heritage and I have to protect it. And so he had credibility in doing that. And in fact, I would say that the cuts were undertaken with reasonable caution to preserve the core structure of public services that affected the most vulnerable, and did so. And that's a very important feature of a sustainable fiscal consolidation, because if you do something like cut a municipality by a third, very likely you're going to find that the public services are going to be such that people will demand that they be restored, and you'll have gone through a lot of pain for not much purpose. You have to think about this, just as you would in a private sector company. You have to think about the sustainability. It's no good if you close all the washrooms to save money. People still have to go somewhere. So it might save money for a couple of days, but that's all that's going to last. That's probably a really bad analogy. I just thought of it. I painted it because it's got a good graphic. But there were the effects on people in Canada were ameliorated actually because the provinces are significant. The provinces in Canada are sovereign in their own right. They have their own tax revenue. They can tax independently. It's not like a local council. In some provinces like Alberta, they get almost no money from the federal government. I think over 90% of their money is from their own tax revenue. And even in Ontario, it's well over 80% at any given time. Only in the Atlantic provinces and the least well-off provinces is there a huge federal presence. So there were some cuts that were difficult. For example, in unemployment insurance, some of the cuts in unemployment insurance that were made resulted in a pretty huge backlash in the Maritimes, in the Atlantic provinces. And in fact, the minister responsible, his office was burnt down in New Brunswick in a riot, and he lost the next election, needless to say. I don't know if he actually went back to his riding to campaign, but I would say that they were fairly measured in the way that cuts were made, and Martin and Chrétien, I think, made an effort to ensure that they weren't as difficult as they might have been. I just have to finish one thought. What happened was a lot of the flexibility that the federal government had previously had in supporting voluntary organizations disappeared. So that, for example, I had been involved in something called the 211, which was setting up a database for human resources in organizations in Toronto. And that was all funded by about $1 million grant from the federal government. That kind of thing just disappeared, gone. So a lot of that kind of flexibility for the extra stuff that added innovation and development to the voluntary sector and to service organizations disappeared and tightened up, and what was left were the core services. I've gone on too long about this.
No, there were a couple of enormous questions, and I sense in the panel a great desire to talk about this question of fairness and in particular sustainability of cuts. And could you also, each of you, reflect briefly upon whether or not the bankers should be paying more? Could I ask Stephen for you to start?
I think on the banks first, what I would look to create or try to introduce is regional banks here in the UK. In Germany, they're more based what's called Landesbanks, and they have a greater affinity and a greater connection with the locality. If we copied that thinking here, you would have the Bank of Manchester or the Bank of Birmingham. So Landesbanks, regional banks, would be very, very helpful. And yes, of course, banks can do more to help and to show attrition. It's not just RBS and Lloyds TSB that were helped. You get HSBC and Barclays saying we didn't take any money from the government, but the government pushed about 600 billion in reassurance guarantees that helped all those banks as well. On fairness, I rolled out how my local authority, and I'm sure many other local authorities from all parties, tried their level best to allocate some fairness or values to their cuts. There is the equality impact assessment that we all have to undertake, and I think it's important that it's not just local authorities that undertake equality impact assessments when they undertake cuts or savings, as they're called, but that the Treasury should be looking at itself and making sure that when it arrives at a wholesale cuts to the economy, that it leads by example and has a perfectly comprehensive equality impact assessment on the impact on those less fortunate than a number of people, i.e. the 8 strands of discrimination or disadvantage, and that should be set in stone.
And have you had to close any metaphorical washrooms?
We have had to take some very, very difficult decisions. Taxi ride scheme for those with mental illness. We've had to look at a number of issues, but what comes from the residents is libraries. And one of the things that created enormous ructions within my borough and gave me my biggest email and post bag was our ending of a non-statutory service, the collection of green waste, especially in Wimbledon Village.
Julian, given that you spoke about fairness, would you like to speak next?
Yeah, I think just picking up on the first sort of question, do we know at the micro level what's actually going to happen here? Partly just coming out of the way we've done this process. This was a very top-down process. This was spreadsheets in the Treasury talking to other government departments. This was not something where you were aggregating up what's actually happening to real people and then figuring out what are the best ways to do things. So the answer to that is no, we have indicators of what will happen, but even if you look at the benefit cuts, which are the easiest to model and to look at, you've got about 25 different things going on inside our benefit system. You then look at what happens inside health, what happens in local authority budgets, the support systems that are really making a difference. So we don't know where this will come out. That sort of links back into some of the fairness sort of agenda. We did some work last year, which was sort of taking 24 members of the public onto a sort of citizens' jury to talk about the cuts. The interesting thing was sort of keeping them for 3 days. So you went through the arguments in a lot of detail. The interesting thing was the way the sort of people built up a sense of fairness. Rather than where they actually came out and what they wanted to do. There was a real sense that the first stage of fairness was stopping unfairness. And here I think there's quite a big political point in here. One of the very strongly perceived unfairnesses was the sort of benefit scrounger, for want of a better word, sort of mentality. And you can see in the government's rhetoric around welfare reform, there's been a lot of concentration on that. And the statistic that people couldn't really get beyond was the fact that there's 5 million households, families in this country who are living on out-of-work benefits. They found that is the justification for a whole set of personal anecdotes about people, none of whom apparently were in the room, but who lived off welfare and weren't there. That is almost certainly a precondition. You have to meet people's expectations of unfairness, but you've also got to be very careful about what does that really mean. In the aggregate, these arguments are very easy to make, and I've worked on various policies where people have made arguments that work very easily in the aggregate. They talk about the amorphous other person who is doing it and then suddenly transform themselves when you get into a parliamentary process and you have MPs with people coming into their office who they recognise as real people who are being affected, and the argument is always exactly the same. Yes, we meant this amorphous, non-existing, well, possibly existing group, but we didn't mean these real people, these real examples. So I think with some of the welfare stuff, we haven't actually seen the real debate yet. That will happen in a parliamentary process for a lot of these reforms, and it will happen in a media process where individual families are very concentrated. Just very briefly, you asked me to say something about banking. I have to say that I think the question takes me in a different space. I know very little about the banking sector, but I do know about the causes of our fiscal situation, and it's very little to do with the banking bailout. But I also don't think that we have had very much discussion of what really happened to the UK public finances. Again, about the fact that this got into political rhetoric, and therefore we're very unclear about the choices that we have politically made for ourselves. Because remember, governments are merely actors who are acting for us as the taxpayers and the consumers of services. And I suspect as this process unwinds, some of the reality of the choices that have actually happened over the last 6, 7 years will actually come home. People will actually start discussing some of the real issues. But anyway, that's sort of not quite the answer to the question, but I think
I am conscious that there'll be more questions, and I'm not going to have every member of the panel answer every question, just so that we can get more questions in. But I think because the nature of those first questions were so fundamental and broad-ranging, we should have every member of the panel answer them. So on to Kitty.
I thought that was an introduction to not bringing me in, but I'll try and be quick. On the banking point, perhaps, I think the Community Reinvestment Act seems to have had a huge positive effect in the US, from what I understand, and I think it would be a great thing to do here and now, and might sort of lance the boil of this sort of residual sense of unfairness amongst the British public as to what happened to the bankers. I think it's far more healthy a solution than banker bashing and banker bonuses, which I think it personally, whilst I can't conceive of ever earning that amount of money, is too personal and actually over the long term quite negative. In terms of the bailout, I agree with Julian. It actually isn't modelled into the fiscal forecast that we've seen and will probably end up returning profit to the taxpayer. It's just the numbers are so big, the public can't get their sort of heads around that, and I'm absolutely sure that we'd be in a far worse situation if it hadn't happened. Thanks, Kim.
Thanks. Now, we're going to have some lady with the red hair at the back there.
Thank you. My name is Sarah Lesniewski, and I'm from the Centre for Skills Development, and my accent gives me away as a Canadian. So I find this discussion very interesting, and I think, not to derail it, but I think this audience could use the benefit of a bit more emphasis on the role of the provinces in Canada and the fact that provinces have exclusive power for things like education and healthcare, which tend to be big heads of spending. So when we talk about how the federal government cut the debt in Canada, I think that point of the role of the provinces can't be underestimated. Some critics have said that the provinces, in fact, had to bear the brunt of it. And I would be interested in getting Michael's opinion on that, considering some of the parallels that are happening right now in England with local government.
And gentleman at the back, and then I'll break my rule and have another one at the front here.
Hi, my name's Alex Watson. I work for an organisation called the Royal Society of Arts. I just wanted to, one of the very ministers who's kind of embarking on these cuts at the moment, before he was in the coalition, this is Vince Cable, actually kind of singled out the Canadian example and Paul Martin and his government's efforts for what he said was a sort of 9-month consultation process going around the country, public meetings, etc. And I wondered whether you thought that that helped either legitimate the decisions or actually improve the decisions. Thanks.
And finally, gentleman at the front.
Thank you. Andy Bell from Centre for Mental Health. Thinking about trying to have pain with rather than without a purpose, I guess there would be opportunities potentially to look at, for example, if we are going to be cutting spending, to look at improving prevention rather than dealing with problems when they emerge, and looking at getting services to work together to support people who we know are the most vulnerable and need the most support from a range of places and indeed cost a lot of money. History suggests in tough times the opposite happens. Drawbridges get pulled up between services and prevention becomes the most expendable thing. You raise your threshold to get any kind of service. Is there any evidence this is being done this time, or indeed from other countries, has it been tested? And what do the panel think we could do to help that happen?
Michael, I'm going to get you to kick off again.
Okay, well, with respect to the provinces, it's a very good point. I try to present a very, keep it short and put in lots of pictures, that's my saying. Just by the way, though that graph is a consolidated government debt, it includes not only provinces, but school boards and local governments as well. So that pattern is not just the federal government, but I have spoken mainly about the federal government, and it is the case that there was a very significant cut in transfer payments to the provinces initially. However, there's a much longer story and more complicated story, because the reality is that those transfer payments within about 2 years started to be rapidly replaced, and it's my belief that within about 4 years the amount of transfer payments that were being paid to the provinces actually were more than would have been paid had nothing been done prior to the constraint. We have to remember that in Canada's case, more than a third of the constraint at the federal level was savings in interest payments, in debt service charges, which are a pretty painless form of savings. And more than that, the provinces also experienced similar savings in interest, because they follow very closely the interest payments by the federal government. So whereas their overall debt load wasn't as large in most provinces, so the savings wouldn't be proportionally as great, they still had significant savings. So it is the case that in many provinces there were substantial implications, and in my province of Ontario, a very hard right-wing government was elected in 1995, and they cut what we call welfare, social assistance, by rates by about 22% or 22%, which was large, a big cut, and such that many people really had trouble, eating and paying the rent. So there were significant fallout. I would argue, and many others have argued, and I could produce the substantive numbers to show that those cuts that were made in Ontario were not necessary. So it would be hard to make the point that sort of the degree of personal suffering of vulnerable people was a consequence of the federal government reduction in transfer payments to the provinces for two reasons. One is because the provinces that did react in that negative way probably didn't have to. And secondly, the transfer payments were, in fact, reinstated later on in any case. The growth in revenue was quite significant. When you have that kind of, the chart isn't up there, when you have that kind of employment growth that you saw, if you can recall that graph, it's surprising what happens to revenue. So the federal government found itself in a position where it was had embarrassingly large surpluses, not embarrassingly large deficits. And there was, that's when the federal government constructed a system of tax credits for child benefits, for example. I was quite involved in that personally. And that was a meaningful offset to many families. So without getting into all the details of it, it's a complicated place because we are so decentralized, and provinces are like a shock absorber for what the federal government does. And they are, by the way, not only are they responsible for most services, but the aggregate spending of provinces is much more than the federal government. And the aggregate revenue of the provinces is more than the federal government. It is a very decentralized country.
Kitty.
I wanted to pick up the point that I think was very well made from the colleague at the front from the mental health organisation about early action and the risk to not investing in invest to save and preventative measures. I think there's a lot of bad news here, and I think there's a few opportunities as well that I think we should kind of collectively find a way of exploring. The bad news is, and perhaps this picks up on the local authority point, is the haste with which these cuts have been designed is part of a desire, I think, to minimise the political fallout in the government, so that ministers in this country don't have their offices burnt down and lose their jobs. And there's two key components of this. First is the single largest saving comes from doing something quite technical, which is uprating benefits in line with the lower measure of inflation, or a less generous measure of inflation. That's really insidious because nobody will notice it, because in cash terms the amount on the chit goes up, but in terms of spending power it will have gone down, and that is thereby taking money away from the poorest who have the least voice in a way that they don't even understand. And the other thing is, by putting so much emphasis on cuts to local authorities, so that you've had to make the very difficult choices that you've had to make, it minimises the national ability for protest, because whilst you might have had problems with your green recycling bins in Wimbledon, that is not going to be the same as the problems in Hackney or wherever, and so therefore the risk that people are going to march down Whitehall is far less. You're the one at risk. And what that does as well is creates a situation where those with the weakest voices locally end up potentially being the ones who are less able to put their case, which of course will be the preventative sort of most vulnerable, and so on. And also, of course, when you're facing the need to cut really quickly and being unable to plan for it, then you can't put the investment into preventative things and give yourself the time to reap the financial returns from that. And who wants to be the leader of the council that cuts child protection? Because that'll come back and hit you when there's an abuse case and so on. So you're always going to focus on the acute and not the preventative. So that's the bad news. I share your concern. I think it's a very good point to make. However, where investing, we're having more joined-up services and investing to save is possible, we now have local commissioners with their backs against a wall to make savings, and it may be that that is the kick that they need to actually talk to each other about how the costs of reaping those savings can be realised. We're hopefully going to publish something at Demos on a local example in Sheffield, where I've seen some evidence that the high turnover of properties in the local housing association is clearly causing costs for GPs because their registers keep changing, and also for schools because their roles keep changing. And if we sort of internalise this and get those who are having to pay to pitch in, then they may be able to get the investment in, family breakdown and debt counselling that's actually kind of causing the stock transfer sort of churn to happen. So the fact that people's backs are against the wall might actually force some innovative thinking. The other opportunity is that the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, is now currently consulting on how to do medium-term fiscal forecasts, which is something that the government, and the IFS did it, but the government has never done. And that then, I think, opens up the whole debate. Is if you have an extra £1 and you invest it to save and the return will come in 10 years' time, actually now's an opportunity to start modelling that because you're doing medium-term forecasts. And one of the pieces of work, maybe the Barrow Cadbury Trust can help with this, that we'd like to do is to actually look at what systematic changes you should make to national government accounts to capture the value of investor-safe projects in a way that hasn't been done before. If we can split it up Del Amy, if we can split it up Capital Current, all of which is revolutionary for government and old hand for the private sector, then perhaps we shouldn't also have a sort of precautionary pot so we can start counting and tracking that type of money. So I think the point that you raise is absolutely key.
Stephen, do you want briefly to comment, and then we can take another couple of questions?
Very briefly, just in reverse order, Andy, regarding prevention. Yes, we have 136 children in our care in the London Borough of Merton. The Care Commission thinks that should be about 200. So yes, we are looking at acute. The bar is always being heightened, and that is a worry. But the government is asking us at a time of cuts to look after health and well-being. That's preventative, but at a time of cuts, we'll do our level best to reduce alcoholism and smoking, but that is a big ask. On consultative process, as Michael said, the first year of cuts was really difficult. Away day, 8 cabinet members, 5 directors, chief executive, myself, all done within a day. So the consultative process was about what we decided. And that was very, very difficult. But there was an exemption for the voluntary sector. We were very keen not to make a decision for the voluntary sector, the most vulnerable there. So very little in the way of... But now we've got service review, zero-based budgeting as we move towards finding 20 million, but still very, very difficult. Finally, on Sarah's point, income raising, local authorities... In my local authority, 18% of our 18%, 1/8 comes from the council tax, and even then, obviously, there's a freeze on that. 75 million is raised by business rates, but we only get £50 million back. We can't decide the poundage. 60% of my income is determined by a grant from local authorities, and that again, it's not. We are not a province. We cannot raise money as well or as easily as provinces in Canada. And so it is quite difficult. And our income is falling because of the recession. People are putting in less planning applications, less environmental health inspections means less money for us, less developers coming. But what we are trying to do is to safeguard employment land so we don't just become a dormitory. We do have land for jobs.
Michael, you just wanted to talk briefly about consultation.
Yeah, well, the gentleman asked about Paul Martin. Yeah, between the 94, remember I said he had a budget in February 94 and then the real cuts in February 95. Paul Martin went around the country, and some of his officials did as well, essentially consulting not so much about where to reduce, but on that there was a need to turn this around. And the sense that in those I went to a few of those meetings myself, obviously. The sense conveyed wasn't really that there's a crisis. It was that there's a long-term trend and it's time to turn it around. And those consultations, I think, were quite effective in creating a consensus that, it was time. We were experiencing an economic boom, and that now is the time to undertake that challenge. So it was an effective and important part of the process in creating a political climate that made it possible.
Anyway, some more questions? Yes, we've got, as always, forest of hands in the last round of questions. I'm going to take the gentleman there in the front. Did you put your hand up? Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Naeem Qureshi from Ashiana Community Project in Birmingham. Firstly, Stephen, it's really refreshing to hear from yourself about the principle of partnership and collaborations, because I think that is a way forward to actually look at efficiency savings. And I just hope that other local authorities will actually follow your kind of insight of actually looking at the future. Julian, talking about public sector management, I think Tony Blair had 3 priorities. I think it was called education, education, education. I think something that you need to take back, duplication, duplication, duplication. Because seriously, the one thing I recognize within the public sector is that you got about 20 managers looking after one particular priority or one particular outcome or output. It's a wasteful resource. And when it comes to the decision of working out what the future will be, it's usually the fighting amongst those particular commissioners or people that make those decisions, because I think their jobs is more important than actually looking at the issues in concern. Michael, those are just comments. Michael, I'm just quite intrigued about the way you actually say public cuts. Is it the case that it was actually about efficiency savings within the public sector and the involvement of the private sector? I really want to know, and I'm being quite confused here, I just want to know, what was the impact of the public services to the citizens of Ontario? And was there like an intention to actually reduce the public sector and make that transition over to the private sector so that jobs will be created, taxation will increase, then reduce your overall deficit? It's just from the graphs, I'm just a bit confused.
No, it wasn't that.
Gentleman on the second row there, and then the last question will be gentleman in the blue shirt in the middle there.
Okay, thanks, Kim. Damon Gibbons, Centre for Responsible Credit. I'm quite surprised, really, that there hasn't been much discussion about one of the defining characteristics of post-2008, which is that households are considerably over-indebted. And I suppose one of the risks of fiscal consolidation would be that as the state does less, individuals and households become more responsible for their own outcomes in life and often end up having to use financial services more as a result of fiscal consolidation than they would previously. So, for example, if you can't get a decent council house, you may be inclined to take on a subprime mortgage at some point and so on and so forth and those sorts of things. So I'm just wondering whether or not, firstly, in Canada, and it probably ties in with the last question, in Canada, whether there was a move to actually go to a residual state in which actually households were much more responsible for themselves and whether that had an impact on financial services markets, and whether or not the panel think that's where we're at in the UK, or whether there was still an intention, and possibly because there was actually growth in Canada, to maintain a certain level of provision which actually prevented that from happening.
Gentleman in blue shirt.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm Graham Fisher from Toynbee Hall. A question, sort of a logical extension, I think, to the last two, in that I'm sort of trying to understand what the implications are in Canada through the fiscal changes on the way the voluntary sector is funded. We stand accused, a bit like public sector managers, we stand accused of becoming too dependent on the state for our funding, and it'd be interesting to know if the fiscal changes in Canada resulted in a different funding profile for the voluntary sector there.
Michael, do you want to pick up those points?
Yeah, I'm going to. I'm going to try to. The fiscal consolidation undertaken by the Chrétien government was not presented as an efficiency. It wasn't presented as an efficiency measure. It wasn't that the public sector stopped doing things. It wasn't and the private sector started doing them. There wasn't that kind of rhetoric around it at all. It was about trying to reduce the cost of public services so that you could reduce the overwhelming. We were paying the federal government was paying 35% of its total expenditure was going on debt servicing charges, which seemed kind of extraordinary. So it was all presented in terms of preserving the important role of the state, not about reducing the role of the state. It wasn't presented as this was a liberal left-center, center-left government, not a right government. Brian Mulrooney, part of the reason that it probably never had been done before effectively was because the Conservative governments couldn't make that argument with credibility. It was precisely, we call it, a Nixon and China phenomena, who can actually do it. But in fact, I would say that it wasn't, it really was, it did not, that particular, that period of fiscal constraint did not change the nature of the Canadian state. We're about to go through, I think, a period where we are going to do that now, but that's not what happened in '95 through the period of fiscal consolidation, and it was the revenue returned so quickly that, in fact, there were a lot of positive changes that were possible, including, as I mentioned, the whole system of child tax credits that didn't even that hardly existed before, that were significant for low-end families. So when I show the chart of public sector employment and private sector employment, it's not that an individual who was working in the public sector went over and started working in the private sector. That's just gross employment figures. It's when employment is buoyant. A lot of that was the automobile sector. Most people don't know this, but Canada is actually the largest exporter of automobiles in the world. Did you know that? No. See, it all goes to the United States, automobiles and parts. And most of it is in Ontario. That's the, so, that's extra shifts in the automobile sector. But when employment is very buoyant and somebody becomes unemployed in the public sector, there are other job opportunities that happen. And and it is difficult if you're over 50, and it's less difficult if you're 30 years old, and less difficult if you've got a good education, and more difficult if you don't, and that kind of thing that is certainly experienced. But it was not presented, nor in my view was it on the part of the central government a matter of permanently reducing the role of the state, although that is in some sense what happened. At the provincial level, there were some in Ontario, as I mentioned, a right-wing government that was elected, and they did go about attempting to permanently reduce the role of the state. And in some sense they did that, but then a Liberal government was elected subsequently, which went about trying to restore, particularly in the area of education, restore the role of the state. So I wish I could tell the story more simply. I do have a few things. Can I add a few things that I really want to say?
Yeah, of course.
One of them is,
you come from Canada.
I hear so often here, and not only here, but in North America as well, this thing with Greece. Well, I got to tell you this, and it might disappoint you, but the UK is not Greece. I mean, you don't have the agency. There's a lot of nice things you don't have here that Greece has, but you weren't occupied by the Ottoman Empire for like 400 years. You didn't have a dictatorship of the of colonels. There is actually a functioning tax system here, which there isn't in Greece. Greece has a crisis, but the UK, it's a very interesting question, Julian. You asked. It would be great to see an actual analysis of what is the cause of the spike in the UK debt and separate it from the rhetoric. The bond market doesn't think you have a crisis because your 10-year gilts are like, they're not even they're 0.2% more than Germany's or something. I mean, it's really small. So your people who actually have to put their money into UK don't say that there's a crisis. I'd also like to say that the UK also was not Ireland. And maybe, if we ask ourselves, well, what happened? Why? The lesson from Canada is interesting. There's also a lesson from Ireland. Ireland didn't have a debt issue, a government debt issue. As many of you probably know, Ireland had balanced budgets, and it had undergone a fiscal consolidation, and its debt to GDP ratio was very low. The problem in Ireland was that it was exposed to an implicit guarantee that the guy who was driving a taxi or building a house didn't know about, namely that he had guaranteed all this lending by the banks and all the bondholders who were holding bonds of the banks and everything else. That's where the source of vulnerability in Ireland had nothing to do with government debt. Had it been 30% or 20%, it didn't make a damn bit of difference. And if you're asking about the lesson from Ireland for the UK, it's, well, where is there implicit guarantees on other debt that that doesn't show up in the national accounts? Are your banks extended in ways that you don't know about? And when you're, going to work the next day and paying your taxes, do you know that you're guaranteeing X, £100,000 in a bank loan? I don't know what the answer is. But sure, the lesson from Ireland isn't about government debt; it's about non-government debt. It's exactly the opposite lesson. So I just wanted to get those 2 points out before we left.
Well, I'm going to try and finish in about 5 minutes, because we've all got drinks, so Julian is next.
Yeah, I'll try to be very brief. I think there's a whole related set of things knocking about here. The central observation is, what's the state about? That tends to underlie successful consolidation. So it's a change for something rather than just a cuts exercise. I think, just going back to the point about duplication, yes, it's true. And actually, I think you don't need to be, public sector managers recognise it. The question is often, it's not that you can recognise this, but what do you do about it when you go back to your own workplace where your managers report up to potentially central Whitehall and are saying these are the priorities, not eradicating this duplication. That will be where the innovation comes, but it is critical to the prevention point. If you're in a consolidation, most of the prevention is too long-term and can't be cashed by the Treasury, so you've got to, if you want to save the preventative and make it better, it's probably about eliminating the duplications in those services. That saves you money, rather than actually there's an extra cash you can put in here, well then you've got to take cash out somewhere else if you're going to make any savings. And finally, I suppose it's the funding of the voluntary sector. Just one observation that I'd make going forward. I don't know the Canadian sort of case, but this government is very, very hot on marketisation, and that will mean a real set of challenges for anyone who's receiving public funding as it comes through the system. Now, it's going to be much harder than I suspect the government thinks at the moment as it's going through this, because if you look actually at the work programme in DWP, they were doing that for a decade or so before they did the work programme, and they've ended up with a market that's very concentrated at its top level in private provision. Lots of other markets this government will look to do. It's probably not a consolidation point. The consolidation just does less cash. But if this government continues in this direction, in 5, 10, 15 years, the funding mechanisms for most of the provision that we currently see as social provision through grant or through just direct money going to organisations will look totally different. And what does a sector look like for that 5, 10, 15-year challenge would be my sort of question.
Stephen and then Kitty, bearing in mind that you are the only thing that now stands between these people and a glass of wine.
As a Greek national, sorry, Michael. Your point is very good. I was inundated with staff phoning me when the cuts or the level of cuts were about to be announced, and they each had their opinion on who should go within their department. But I think staff can be entrepreneurial as well. So that there's a level at which we just simply assume that businesses, entrepreneurs are entrepreneurial, but staff workers can be entrepreneurs. So we'll try and get that across, and that's why we're seeking social entrepreneurship styles on residents and their problems and their disadvantages and the credit crisis and so on. We've set up a credit union to help residents with access to funds, small sums of money, and I think that will be helpful. And at the same time, lowering their expectations of what they can glean from the local authority. And that continues on to my third and final point, and that is that the voluntary sector will increasingly become more important as the state tries to reduce the role of the government tries to reduce the role of society by talking about the big society. We've tested that. One of our libraries is under threat of closure on Mondays, so we've asked volunteers to step in and make sure it's opening on Mondays, and that is still very, very difficult to achieve. So I do believe that the government should first and foremost shore up the voluntary sector before talking about the big society.
I think what we should all learn from this is that policy changes made based on evidence and thinking things through can often lead to very good results, but policy changes based on knee-jerk reactions and ideology will probably at some stage go wrong. I've finished now, so you can drink.
Just asking me a question.
I was just asking if Michael wanted to give us one more line.
Well, my one more line is thanks for inviting me.
Well, thank you very much for coming. Thank you to our panel. I think we have asked an awful lot of very, very interesting, crucial questions and not necessarily answered all of them by any means.